welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I'm Kyle.
And I'm Juan, and we are here with the last lecture of the Real American Founding, The Founding Today.
Yeah, I think this is the lecture that we've all been waiting for, which is how can the founders guide us? What can we learn from the founders? Where do we go? What lessons can we learn from them today?
Yeah, this is my favorite lecture. And the reason is because, this is why I study politics. You and I have been studying politics for probably a decade now. And this is why you study it, right? Because you want to know how do you make the world better today? How do you affect your political community to make better decisions for politicians today? How do you make better policies that will make people's lives better today? And that's why you study the founding. That's why you study political philosophy. That's why you study all these things. So, we in this course, we've looked at social compact theory, for example. And that's perfect because it helps you to identify how you should have your policies today in regards to immigration and other things. And then we looked at marriage policy. Well, how should we think about marriage policy today? Obviously, we live in a different time than the founding, but looking at how they thought about their problems is very helpful in thinking how we think about our problems today. And that's exactly what Dr. West and Azerrad do in this lecture.
No, that's exactly right. I hope that this course has been helpful to you to have that mindset of the founders, right? To be able to take some of their core principles, their ways of approaching political problems in their time, and be able to use that to kind of spark our own solutions, right? With the circumstances that we face today. I think there's a lot there that can help and guide us. I hope you enjoy this final lecture, and I hope that you stay with us and continue to learn with Hillsdale College Online Courses. If you are thinking about another course, I would like to recommend my personal favorite. It's Dante's Divine Comedy, taught by Professor Steve Smith here in our English department. I know that oftentimes cracking into a great book of literature, especially one of poetry, can be a very daunting thing. And that's why I love our literature courses so much. They help kind of provide a guide, right? A way into a book, a way to explore these big ideas, help when we might get lost. Professor Steve Smith is probably the greatest guide I've seen through these amazing works of literature. I think Dante's Divine Comedy has so much to say about our own lives, right? How to lead a good life.
I don't know if I've told you this, but it actually is also my favorite course.
Is it really?
Because it first of all, you hear Dante, right? And you're like, well, I don't know if I want to read a poem that goes on for, 99 cantos or 100 cantos?
Especially one that's written originally in Italian, right? What am I going to do with this?
Right. But then when I took the course for that, because I think that's the first course that I worked on, you understand the depth of following the heart of Dante as he's transformed by God in the different levels of, hell and then purgatory and paradise. It's absolutely fascinating. So anytime somebody asks me, what is the course that I recommend the most? It's my favorite. So I usually tell people, take Dante.
No, we love that. It is a dream journey from hell up to heaven. But what it really is character formation, right? From being a person that is doing the wrong thing and turning their soul and starting to live a life according to virtue and according to, how God expects us to live and draws us to live. So it's an amazing story. I hope you check it out at hillsdale.edu/course. That's Dante's Divine Comedy with Professor Steve Smith. It's available at hillsdale.edu/course, along with our other 40 free online courses. And now I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Azerrad and Dr. West for our final lecture on the Real American Founding.
What do you think the founders would think of contemporary America? Would they even recognize it?
Well, yeah, in some ways, sure. This is a country that still continues to follow their ideas, their way of life. Much diminished, but it's still not dead. For example, I remember reading after the Katrina incident, hurricane in Louisiana. The people who were living in New Orleans were absolutely helpless. They couldn't figure out what to do. We're all like, well, this government will come in maybe. People who were living out in the rural areas, though, that was all self-help. Like they took care, what can we do to help our neighbor? Does this person need rescuing? They'd contact people. That was the older America is still alive. People working together, trying to achieve something, trying to do what's right by their fellow citizens, and deal with the crisis, not just by waiting for government, but by self-help. That was fundamental to the founding. Other thing, of course, secondly, there's still many places in America, there are many individuals in America who are happily married in the old sense of husband, wife, and kids, and doing well. People have jobs. People are doing, normal crises in life, but fine. Protection of the laws. Like here in Hillsdale, if somebody breaks into your house, they'll come if you call them. They might, if somebody steals something, they might actually look into it. In places like Houston, I know this from a report done in Houston a few years ago, the government just flat out doesn't investigate most property crime. Most crimes, like where somebody steals something, even something important like a car. But there's still a lot of individual liberty in this country, freedom, in the old sense, the good sense of not licentiousness. From the point of view of the founders, they would have said that's healthy liberty.
We're the only developed or Western nation in the world that has not criminalized hate speech. Now, you get canceled for it and fired and demonized on the internet, but you don't get sent to jail the way you would in Canada or in France or elsewhere. So,
yeah, that's a good example. Another one is gun rights.
Yeah.
America is now increasingly respects and accepts the right to keep and bear arms individually. They keep trying to find ways to go after it. But there are just so many people in America who own guns or who think gun ownership is good. They have a hard time with that. Third example is homeschooling. Homeschooling is illegal in most of the Western world, meaning, you need to be in a government school with a government-approved curriculum, with a government teacher there to explain to you about the nature of your sexuality at 6 years old. In America, if a parent doesn't like that, they can take their kid out of school and do it and take them home and teach them there. They can do that in America. It's in some ways it's still a free country,
but in other ways it isn't.
I gave an example earlier in the first session about what do you do with jury trials where people convict on the basis of race or political orientation. America only works as a country that's democratically or Republican, governed in the Republican manner, when the people as a whole think justice is important. In a sense, justice in the sense of treating people similarly under similar circumstances, independently of their race, their sex, and so on. Think of one of the topics we talked about earlier is that there's a basic idea of civil rights, a civil right you have as a citizen to travel, to have access to any organization that offers public transportation. Unlike that, today you have in America, people put on no-fly lists arbitrarily. You can't appeal it. There's nothing you can do. You've never been put on trial. We're not saying you ever did anything wrong. We just think you might someday do something wrong.
So what are the most egregious violations of rights that occur in America today as judged from the perspective of the political theory of the American founding?
Well, let's take the two principles of the Declaration, rights, security of rights, and consent of the governed. Consent of the governed, that only works if your elections are honest and fair, and if they're not too heavily dominated by wealth. How can you have that in a country where, let's say 3/4 of the population surveyed for the last 50 years has said there's way too much immigration. And yet for 50 years, Congress has refused to do anything about it at all, except posture.
Well, and try to give amnesty to illegals.
Well, of course, yeah. But that's part of it, right? So, basically non-enforcement of the law. But in this case, and what's the law? The law is what the people's representatives have done. If you don't enforce the law, that means you're turning your back on Republican government. And that's what the country has decided to do more and more. Not the country, but the government has decided to do to its people. But the other side is security of rights. How do you secure individual rights? That requires protection. And protection means prosecution of criminals and putting them away. How can you have that when you have major cities throughout the country openly admitting, well, we don't even look into property crime. We don't even look into, there are many, several cities were surveyed a few years ago. Thousands of women had reported that they had been raped. Places like Memphis and Detroit and others. And of course, the police dutifully took down the rape kit, basically did the examination to see whether in fact there's some probability of that. But in these jurisdictions, they don't even look into it beyond that. These rape kits just sit there in some locker somewhere, and some police says, well, we don't have any funding for that. What do you do in a country where you have rioting all through the summer of 2020, where people are burning down businesses, they're ransacking businesses, they're breaking into stores, and the government says, well, we just don't think we're going to do anything. There was one case, there was a demonstration in Denver where these people were being attacked by Antifa. Conservatives were speaking there, being attacked by Antifa, and the police were told, you do not protect those people. That is what is called protection of the laws in the founding. Fundamental purpose of government, protect people by enforcing criminal and civil law. And we have now, increasingly, a government that will only do so selectively. Some people call this anarcho-tyranny. Sam Francis, I think, may have invented that term. A commentator who was prominent in the American scene in the 80s and 90s. Well, anarcho-tyranny is not a free society. And that, to that extent, the founders would say, I don't know what kind of a country I'm looking at. It's not what we tried to do.
So is it, or are we not still a republic judged by the principles of the founding?
Well, the answer is to some degree, yes, and to some degree, no.
And to some degree, no, we are what then?
Well, I would call it an oligarchy. I believe our country is a mixture of oligarchy, rule of the wealthy, combined with rule of the people through elections. Elections still count for something. They're not completely canceled. They're not canceled everywhere. They're not always stolen. But many times they are stolen with the connivance of the oligarch, the connivance of the people in the media who are rich, the people in manufacturing who are rich, the people who are in government who are rich often because of outright bribes given to them by the various lobbying interests that support them. The oligarchic element in our society has gone way beyond anything the founders would have tolerated. And we talked a little bit earlier about how voting rights were there was a somewhat oligarchic element in early American voting rights. Like you had to be a taxpayer, let's say, in most states. But that's not we're talking now about people who are massively wealthy, influential, and have control over major segments of the economy, dictating the course of how American justice is enforced and even how elections are conducted.
So how did we get here? I mean, one prominent line of interpretation on the right is to survey the cultural and political degeneration of contemporary America, and to argue that this is a working out of our founding principles, that it's basically a slippery slope from the ideas of equality and liberty to the egalitarianism and licentiousness of the age. It's an old argument. There's a version of it in Robert Bork's Slouching Towards Gomorrah and Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind. How does one respond to this claim? Basically, that the mess we're in today, that drag queen story hour at the local library, is a working out of the principles of the founding.
Yeah, well, again, it's like, first of all, I kind of wonder, do any of these people ever look at any founding documents other than the famous Declaration of Independence, which doesn't have a pronouncement on gay rights? But many of the other founders did have a great deal to say about the family and the moral conditions of maintaining it, and thought that sort of thing should be discouraged, if not absolutely prohibited, but certainly discouraged in any public expression. But I think in a general way, there was a formulation by one of my teachers, Leo Strauss, who suggested that modern liberalism, in the 20th century sense of the term, is based on the idea that all life, no matter what, is worthy of being, worthy of dignity and respect. Secondly, that the only principle of virtue is humanitarianism and compassion. And third, government should be devoted to allowing the people to indulge their lowest passions, pursue pleasure, and never with a thought of self-sacrifice or any concern with the noble. Those three things, like if you had told George Washington, that's what you're building and that's what you're standing for, he would have just looked at you like, I don't know what kind of a rock you crawled out from under. That's despicable. Because they would have said, first of all, human life is not always worthy. Criminals need to be punished, and if need be, executed. They were okay with that. In fact, they thought not only was that okay, that's what justice means. That's true respect for human life. Means you don't put up with people who run around harming people and acting like, well, I can just do whatever I want. And also, degraded life. They thought if someone is living in a manner that is despicable or degraded, they thought it was important for public officials and private individuals, to speak out about that, to teach their children, you don't want to be that way. That's vile. That's not a way of life of a decent human being and citizen. And as for humanitarianism and compassion, the founders find that look, poor people, sure, we get it. There are people who are poor. We try to help them, to some degree we can. We don't elevate them. We don't argue that the whole purpose of society is for everyone to devote themselves to the well-being of the least among us. They would have thought that was an absurd principle to go by. No, you go by merit. People should be honored to the extent to which they earn it, that because of their qualities of mind, their character, their achievements. That should be respected, not infinite compassion and infinite humanitarianism.
The best authors open our eyes to truths that we would otherwise miss. They teach us to see the world anew and to catch the little things that are lost in our daily routine. Charles Dickens had this gift, and A Christmas Carol is one of his best expressions of it. In Hillsdale College's new, free online course, Charles Dickens is A Christmas Carol, Professor Dwight Lindley explains why this little ghost story is a classic of Western literature. By taking this course, you'll encounter the divine. You'll see Christ entering the world of Ebenezer Scrooge and changing the heart and soul of a lost man. This Christmas, we invite you to join us as we enter the mysterious world of Ebenezer Scrooge, Bob Cratchit, Jacob Marley, the Ghosts of Christmas, and Tiny Tim in our newest online course, Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. To enroll today and secure your spot in this completely free online course, visit hillsdale.edu/new course, NEWCOURSE. Once again, for this completely free online course, visit hillsdale.edu/new course.
The way I put it to my students is that all human beings possess dignity, but not all ways of life are equally dignified, and no one is entitled to be honored if they live their lives in a certain undignified way. But what about the Tocqueville critique that the problem lies in democracy, i.e. the entire Western embrace of the idea of equality that transcends the particularities of the founding? He saw this happening across the West, beginning in the Middle Ages. And to a certain sense, couldn't you say that that's what Plato saw in his description of democracy in Book 8 of the Republic, that there is something in any democratic regime, however constituted, whether it be natural rights or something else, that goes in this direction of celebrating the lowest common denominator?
Yeah, sure it does. That's right. And so that's why, from the point of view of the founders, they never elevated democracy as the highest principle or equality in the sense of independence of moral law. They never claimed that. And that's why they did it, for that reason, because they could see that in a democracy that's constituted in the way that Plato describes, where everybody gets to do whatever they want and participate in rule if they want, not participate if they want, walk down the street making fun of everyone. I mean, sure, you can have that. And in any democracy, there's going to be a tendency towards that. But at the same time, there are limits on that. There are reasons why the people at the time of the founding this is something we have to make sure doesn't happen here if we can. That's why they care about education, moral character, family law, all the things that we've talked about.
Yeah, I think this word tendency is key. What I don't like about this, many of these critics, is there's a fatality they adopt that once you posit this idea, it must necessarily lead to this. And I think there are no necessities in the realm of politics. The analogy I sometimes use is, you could say America has a genetic predisposition to go in a certain direction, but it's not fated to do so. And that, by the way, is what every regime has. I mean, every political community is going to lean in one direction rather than the other. And the task of statesmanship is to forfend this.
Yeah, I guess I would add, though, the problem we have now is we're not any longer talking about democracy working itself out qua democracy or qua equality. We have oligarchy and increasingly tyranny throughout the Western world. The idea that Western Europe represents democracy, to me, it's laughable. So when Orban gets elected in Hungary as the prime minister and his parliament decides to reform the judicial law of the country, the European Union says that's undemocratic. You're not allowed to do that. I don't care if you're elected and your elected legislature wants to change it. You're not allowed to do what we call democracy. And then you realize it's all a joke. It's a sham, this whole idea of democracy now.
Yeah, they've basically redefined democracy to mean what the people should vote for if they were smart enough to know what's good for them. And when they're too dumb and stubborn to go that way, we're going to force feed it to them via regulations, judicial rulings, or flat out ignoring their vote, as happened with the French referendum to get out of the EU.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's right. And we see the same thing here. The people can vote for President Trump. They'll find some way to impeach him.
Twice.
Yeah. Interestingly, over Ukraine, all of the special deals being made by our ruling class with Ukrainian oligarchs, corrupt oligarchs over there. Why is the United States so interested in promoting Ukraine and being interested in, Ukraine is the last bastion of democracy? What a joke. It's that over there, they make our country look like a well-governed nation. Everything's corrupt. Everything's oligarchic. Rule of law is sporadic. It's, we got this idea. We've lost the frame for thinking clearly about politics in the modern world, insofar as you listen to, let's say, mass media, mainstream academic opinion. And that, to me, that's why it's so important, from my point of view, to understand what actually happened in the founding. What would they think about what we're doing now? Is what as opposed to what people keep saying is, that's just the inevitable outcome of what the founders were setting up. And setting up unconsciously. That's the other argument I find. These people say, the founders were doing it unconsciously. They didn't know they were actually creating this corrupt republic because they thought, that their principles would do something about that.
That they
were very aware. Constant talk in the founding era about the problem of corruption of every regime, especially in democracy, especially when a country gets wealthy. When you get a country that is so immensely wealthy, as most Western countries are, how do you any longer have any respect for or understanding of necessity and reality? You can live in a kind of dream world that you've made up for yourself, cooked up for yourself. I can do anything. I can become a cat. I mean, this is one of my favorites, these people today. I'm a cat boy. And run around having people tell them, have to address them as a cat. What kind of a world could that be possible in, except one that is so immensely wealthy that people have lost touch with reality?
Okay, but the wealth is a result of the fact that we live in a commercial republic, that we have property rights and markets. Yeah. The intention of America is to produce peace and prosperity on a very large scale, in part by rechanneling the spirited ambitions of men away from war towards commerce. I always tell my students, we honor entrepreneurs and founders of companies, not people who engage in vast military conquests. So isn't that then perhaps a problem with the regime, that it is designed to produce conditions that will then undermine the regime itself?
Yeah, there's some truth to that, for sure. That Hamilton explicitly made that same argument. The more you protect property, the more wealthy we become, and the more wealth we are, the more corrupt we'll be. This is something that all the founders talked about, worried about, and did the best they could. The real question is, well, should they then have said that no one's allowed to go into business? Should we just live in poverty like the Indians? I mean, we could have done that. But even Jefferson didn't want to do that. He said, yeah, we should be a nation of farmers, but he was fine, actually, it turns out, with commerce. And in fact, no farmer in America lived in the way he described. No Southern plantation owner lived in the way he said. We're all just self-sufficient. We live with our own, produce our own food. No, they were selling tobacco to England. That was what they were doing. They were already in the market.
Yeah.
But no, you're right about that. But that goes back to your other point earlier, which I think is which I agree with. Every regime is going to have within itself something that's going to undermine it, which is why politics is never going to end. There's never going to be a solution to the political problem. The founders didn't solve it. They did the best they could in the circumstances and made things they thought better. And they did, I think, arguably make things better for the American people than they would have been. Actually, I would take issue with your earlier statement about Americans honoring entrepreneurs. Who are the people who are in the statues in all these little small towns all over America? I'm sure there are going to be some to entrepreneurial figures, but many of them are to soldiers, generals, war dead. People honor war, and they honor winners in war. How many presidents have we had who are winners in war? Starting with Washington, right? Ulysses Grant, Eisenhower. That's something we care about. The Americans have always respected. And why not? Because as Hobbes says, anything strong is by nature honorable. People love that. They love to respect strength. And strength in the service of the public good, people definitely, it's especially honorable. That's what this is.
In your book, you're mostly concerned with presenting the political theory of the American founding.
Right.
But you're clearly impressed by it and think that it has much to teach us. But you're not calling for a straight-up return to the founding. I guess I'd ask you two questions. Do you think it's possible to return to the American founding today, to the theory of the founding? And second, do you think it's desirable?
I'd say to the extent to which the founders were discovering or rediscovering permanent principles of political life, it's always possible to return. And in fact, it's inevitable that there will be a return at some point in some country somewhere. I mean, protection. The idea that the natural rights theory leads to the conclusion that government needs to have a strict criminal law and enforce it. That's not something the founders discovered. That's not something you need the natural rights theory to explain. That's something going back to any time anybody's ever thought of government. That's what government's supposed to do. And similarly with foreign policy. The founders had a view of foreign policy. It should be basically about national defense. Because of the principles of the Declaration, which promoted the idea of both self-defense and non-intervention. Okay, but how is that not true of many people throughout all human history? There are many things about politics that are just going to, at family. Think about the family, marriage, the older American understanding of the family. You didn't need America to discover that. That was a long tradition going back to the ancients. what we call the monogamous family of a male and a female with their kids, and then, their associated relatives. This, again, is not something that the bourgeois world has invented. These ideas. Now, it's true that if you have the political theory of the founding in your mind, and it helps you to think clearly, I think, about, well, how should these things actually specifically be organized? To what extent should patriarchy be the rule versus having more of a women's voice, which the founders did go with and approved of? Those are questions like that the theory would help you with. But look, today, this theory is so widely and massively misunderstood. I often despair of even expecting anyone to think about it clearly, other than college students in my classes. Well, I had your classes too, David. But there are not too many others where you could count on the teacher to give them an actual real sense of what the founders were trying to do, what they meant by their ideas.
Okay, but you brought up the family. I mean, one of the lines that jumped out of me in the book is you said that a politician today who cared about marriage and wanted to go back to the founders' policy on families, you said would be stark mad to do so.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
Today, right now, politically speaking, you can't do anything like coverture, the older system of male authority in the family. However, what you could do today is make family law more genuinely fair to both sides. People who are involved in family law, especially the lawyers, they will openly admit everything in family law is biased towards the feminine, the female point of view. And in fact, you can be run out. If you're a judge that tries to give equal time to the male and the female, you can get run out, as happened to a judge in Maine. How about more equality? That kind of equality under the law. That's the older understanding that still to some degree resonates in America. People get that. People get the idea that, for example, if someone commits perjury in court in order to gain custody of their children, I think if people knew that that's never prosecuted in America, or almost never, that's something they might be willing to support. Let's have actual real prosecutions for these people who go into court and lie about their husbands or their boyfriends in order to get custody, in order to jack up the, And another point would be, what about this idea that marriage automatically leads to the custody of the mother? That's been a problem in American law for quite a while now.
Yeah, but no one makes the case in public for these things. So one of the reasons I, for one, refuse to give up on the country is I really don't feel that all the arguments have been made and we've given it our best shot, and that there's an awful lot of common sense left in the American people. Another good example are what we euphemistically call affirmative action, but are just straight up racial preferences, discrimination in favor of one race against the other. If you poll properly, i.e., if you explain to the people what is going on, there's still opposition to it. California, out of all places, reaffirmed the ban on racial preferences 6 months after the Floyd riots by a wider margin than it did when they first passed it in the 90s. California. Now, the problem is these bans then don't get enforced because the politicians don't have the will to deal with the courts, the bureaucracy, and the attacks in the media. But I feel that there's a real, let put it to you this way, that the demand for bold statesmen who champion some of these things is much greater than the available supply right now.
Yeah, that's a great example, too, the affirmative action point you're making. Many states have passed bans on affirmative action, racial preference. So Michigan, for example. But nobody pays any attention to it whatsoever. It's like a dead letter. The law gets passed and the courts just treat it as a dead letter. Why? This goes back to consent. If you're going to have government by consent, it means the government can't overturn consent. It can't change the decisions of the people. If the people want it to be a certain way, they should be allowed to have it. No, if it doesn't violate the Constitution, it doesn't violate it. It doesn't violate any constitutional norm. They just simply agree to ignore it. That's how that works.
So if you were trying to dislodge from the American regime some of the laws or Supreme Court decisions or amendments that have most damaged the founders' regime, that have most put a dent in the founders' political theory, what are some of the ones you'd single out that we're going to need to repeal or scale back?
Well, when you think about the main task of government, which is protection, and especially protection through support of criminal law and national defense, which includes defense of the borders. That's first and foremost. And the courts have accepted the idea that when Congress passes a law, no, the executive branch is not obliged to enforce it. The courts all over America, state level, federal level, like the case in Denver I mentioned, where the conservatives who were having a demonstration were assaulted, literally attacked and physically assaulted, and the police were told to do nothing, and the courts wouldn't do anything, nobody would do anything. The Supreme Court wouldn't even dream of caring about that case because the Supreme Court has ruled that no individual in the executive branch of any state or federal government has any obligation whatsoever to enforce the law. A non-duty to protect. So that the police are, police have been sued many times for their refusal to protect people. And the courts have said, that's fine. There's no duty to protect in the Constitution. We don't see it. Well, that's what equal protection of the laws used to mean, originally meant. Protection means protection against violence and exploitation, and that means serious law enforcement. So, if anything, one thing that would be right there. How about enforcing the law? How about the idea that how about courts saying for a change, you're in such and such, an administrative official, you're a police, you're in the EPA, or whatever, you have to enforce the law.
Oh, we can't do that because that's racist. That's the...
Well, they'll say stuff like that, yeah. Or they'll just use the technicality. Well, I don't see anywhere in the Constitution where there's a duty to protect. Why is it that the first presidential duty is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed in the Constitution? And you don't ever hear that phrase quoted because they're too busy making up executive orders that contradict existing law, or they're too busy refusing to enforce existing law.
It's what I like so much about your approach to explaining and teaching the founding is you focus on the most commonsensical, basic fact that tends to get overlooked. Everyone runs into the highfalutin abstract principles or the little smaller debates, but you focus on the basic function of government, which is to protect its citizens. And
right. And that's one. The other one, the other thing, how about freedom of association? The founders used the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in their declaration. Okay, what does the liberty part of that mean? What everyone assumes means is that you can't be turned into a slave. It also means you're free in your private life to associate with, to organize your life in any way you think is appropriate. Always within, of course, the bounds of the law, which requires you to not do anything that injures other individuals or the state. Okay, association. That right has been banned. That's part of what affirmative action is all about, is to ban the right of an employer to hire the most qualified employee.
Yeah, freedom of association, to put it in more polemical terms, includes a right to discriminate, that no one has a right to join your club or to be hired by you. Now, that's not what we think anymore in America, and the 1964 Civil Rights Act dealt a very serious blow to the freedom of association, but I think we need to recover the distinction between the morality and the legality of an action. You could say, I think it's wrong for such a person not to hire a qualified candidate, but it shouldn't be illegal in a free country. The markets can take care of it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that is the founders' view. They, in the case of, one of the things I like, in Madison, the famous Federalist 10, okay, everyone supposedly reads Federalist 10. How do you deal with the problem of faction? And one of the points Madison makes that I like to emphasize to my students is he says, you can't try to solve the problem of faction by taking away individual liberty. Meaning, meaning that government can't supervise private associations. He says there are going to be groups that come together to promote things that government disapproves of. He says you have to accept that in a free society. That basic principle of the founding was overturned in the 1960s. as Chris Caldwell points out in his book on this, it's a new constitution starting in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. You no longer have that freedom to decide on your own way of life, your own choices.
Helen Andrews wrote a review of that book, The Age of Entitlement, for the Claremont Review of Books that was entitled The Law That Ate the Constitution.
Yeah, it's good. Good metaphor. Yeah. But, going back to the founding again, what was the thing they thought human rights were all about, individual rights and the moral law? It was about protecting Americans in their associations, which really means protecting an American way of life that already to some degree existed in 1776, but also they thought needed to be improved on the basis of their better understanding of the moral law that they gained through the founding principles. But that American way of life included, and this is the respect in which the founders were paleo-cons, traditionalists. Like, yeah, we like our Christianity, we like our Protestantism, we like our family, our monogamous, family, which is now defined as just one version of the family. We like having our own houses and our own farms, and many of us, who work for wage labor, we aspire to own things of our own. That was the older view. The view that Edmund Burke warned the British Parliament about. He said, "You got to be careful with these Americans. Don't try to push them around. They have such a fierce spirit of independence that they will smell tyranny coming on just a breeze, and they'll come after you." That was the old spirit, the old gun rights spirit. Yeah, you want to come into my house and harm my family, you get shot. And that way of life as a whole, the modern state, and this is true throughout the whole Western world, the modern state is the enemy of the idea of an old way of life of a particular people. Mm-hmm. The modern state wants to turn everything into routine, bureaucracy, process, take the life out of things. And take and turn, and so instead of the older American way of life, to speak of people only as individuals or as belonging to this or that oppressed group, as opposed to I have a community, a family, a place, a way that I know that I should be doing things. And to the extent to which that can be preserved under modern conditions, whether it's through appeal to the founders' principles or through appeal to traditionalism, whatever it is, that I think is a healthy instinct to keep that going.
One last question for you. With the wisdom of hindsight, which of course the founders did not possess, what do you think they could have better done to inoculate the country, if you will, against progressivism, liberalism, the new left, the sexual revolution, all that came afterwards? I guess, or to put it more bluntly, do you have a critique of the founding as someone who has spent the better part of his career vindicating and defending the founding?
Well, I think the founders can be criticized with respect to there's some governmental institutions. For example, it seems like the Supreme Court didn't really do what they wanted it to. They was hoping the Supreme Court could do a good job of policing the boundary between state and federal government responsibility. The Supreme Court hasn't done a good job of that, I would argue. The Supreme Court was supposed to be able to stick up for individual rights in the Bill of Rights, and you can go down the Bill of Rights today and show how every individual right in the Bill of Rights is routinely being violated by state, local, and federal government, and the Supreme Court only occasionally and opportunistically intervenes. So there's that. Okay, and so and that was partly why we had to have a civil war, because the jurisdictional boundaries were never really clear and accepted, and so that was one big problem. But beyond that, I don't know. You've got I think what we have left of federalism, I think, is great. I'll give the example of COVID. We had massive civil disobedience throughout the state of Michigan, outside the big cities and their big suburbs. And we had a real life. We had life here in Hillsdale. People got together, they had parties, they had dinners, they had real life. Boys and girls were talking to each other. They were even kissing sometimes, courting. we can't. Elsewhere in the nation, it was like you had to be locked away in your house for months and months, driving people nuts, as people are now understanding. Many mental health problems. Why did that happen? Why in Michigan? Well, it's local government here. The local police were very, we don't know if we have any resources to use to enforce the governor's orders, and I don't know if we'll be able to arrest that restaurant owner who's violating. We'll get around to that later, maybe. They were great in that way, because these orders were all illegal and unconstitutional. From the point of view of the founders, they would have said that.
Well, I think that's a fitting note to end on, that there's something of the vigilant and manly spirit that remains in the American people. Thank you, Tom, for taking the time to sit down for this conversation. I hope it'll inspire the people who watch to read both of your books on the American founding, and more generally to return to the founding and study it with the care it deserves. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale Online Courses podcast. If you want to continue learning about America's founding or other topics, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There you can find over 40 free online courses, including American Citizenship and Its Decline with Victor Davis Hanson, Ancient Christianity, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Republic, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thank you for listening.